Alright guys, pretty much immediately after my last video, the Federal Reserve is pretty much projecting that they're gonna start their interest rate cuts. And the United States is pretty much the declining power. We're gonna go through those powers in history. We're gonna explain how debt killed these nations and effectively how debt is going to kill the United States unless a very balanced approach is taken to offload pain to others from the government. So our first example of debt being a contributor to a decline that we're going to talk about, we're pretty much going to start from here, is Rome. Rome minted its own coins, controlled its minting, and what they did was they would keep a coin of the same face value of the coin, but they began to make the coin smaller and smaller. This is known as clippage or coin clipping. And basically your quarter turns into a nickel and nickel turns into a dime. And then once you get to a dime, clippage converted into where they began using other metals that weren't gold or silver or accepted value metals. So then it became the penny, and this was basically to maintain the name of a coin while also reducing the cost that it gave Rome to create these dollars. On the way down, another thing that Rome began to do was it began looting religious temples for their coffers or their sacrifices, tithes, whatever, and taking those as tribute to basically bolster the coffers to slow the decline of the empire unwinding. Ultimately, this led to the split of Rome and Byzantium, and they ultimately allowed the majority of Rome to fold in order to not intervene in, say, basically Byzantium. And that was pretty much the end of Rome and the effects of basically inflation, because the inflation back then was conducted through clippage and then by poor metal replacements after clippage wasn't enough anymore. So they started mixing in lesser metals, and that drove them over the edge. The next useful collapse would be the Dutch due to the tulip bubble. This was driven mainly by religious restrictions on things that you could basically spend your vanity on. And because there was religious pressure on these tulips, there was an artificial demand placed. And once the artificial demand really took over, it was really all these people wanted. And the tulips began to cost more than homes. And if you just think about that under like a utilitarian perspective, there's no way a flower should hold the same utility as a home. But vanity got the best of these people. And also, these people were trading on futures on like, I can grow this in the future, pay me now, and I will deliver the tulip later. And production did not meet demand, and that is where basically you had futures contracts that were undeliverable, and tulip bubble bust. And it took the entire nation with it. They still do things in this area to basically hide the decline of their financial position, such as in some of it's Netherlands or Denmark, your mortgage is transferable for homes. It leads to bad price discovery, and it makes homes really entrenched as far as difficult to buy into, and the mortgage itself is almost more valuable than the home itself. And this is also driven by that same country's ability to write off your mortgage payment as a tax deferment or tax write-off. And taxes in the country are extraordinary. So the mortgage itself is an asset in a tax mitigation loophole. So nobody's going to pay cash for a house because they want their mortgage for the tax write-off to lower their tax burden. And your real estate market, and even more, your mortgage market becomes extremely entrenched then, which makes real estate really inaccessible by like barriers to entry. And that's pretty much what happened then, and pretty much what's still happening now in Denmark. Pretty sure it's Denmark. The next collapse would be the British. Endless wars across the empire were causing debt to build up. But then the debt that was held by entities itself was just unmanageable. The debt held by certain entities after the Battle of Waterloo also made it pretty much unmanageable. Waterloo was pretty much when they lost control of the ability to manage their interest rates, and they lost the ability to manage the people who owned that debt. So as this bubble was getting bigger and bigger throughout Britain, they tried to find more and more taxes to levy on people to manage the payments for these debts. And it got to the point to where in the Americas, the saying was no taxation without representation. And representation wasn't given. And a tax was levied on the stamp. It wasn't so much the taxes themselves, it was more the Stamp Act that motivated individuals to no longer abide by the rules. Because you needed this stamp to enter and exit ports, carry certain goods, tea, which led to the Boston Tea Party. And you needed a stamp to do everything, but the stamp itself became a tax. And because these stamps basically made things accessible or permissible, a lot of people started to get priced out because of the stamp tax, and then the tea tax, and et cetera, et cetera. And people they had to rebel. And if your ship wasn't allowed to leave harbor because tea was on it, the Boston Tea Party was people coming on board, tossing over tea to basically allow a ship freedom of access because it wasn't allowed to depart. And the people who did the Boston Tea Party returned to the ship within the week and paid for the damages and also provided them new locks and keys for the keys that they had broke to conduct the Boston Tea Party. This taxation drove a lot of conflict throughout the empire, but the empire itself was under a lot of other colonial stress from other rebellions for various reasons, and was losing the Americas was a major cash cow. And after that, it was pretty much over for them. And it was just up until Waterloo when they lost control of their debt. When Britain wasn't dead, it was just terminally ill, and it just took a while to die. The next collapse was France. That again created vast inequalities. It also hindered the ability of people to retain their value as far as currency or like physical goods. Things became so unstable, people couldn't access necessities, and anytime that you disengage someone from access to necessities, food, water, and you're living in a position where you say give them cake, which is probably a misquoted statement from history, revolution is coming, and revolution sure did come in France. And they did not give up their guillotines for a very long time. And that was the end of France's dominance as a considerable power for a very long time in Europe. And for the next 100 years, they got not great at efficiently winning wars. So that's the problem. And the United States is pretty much in these prior empires collapsing positions. It's because the nation's debt pretty much dominates all rational thinking and decisions at the government level. And everyone's just pretty much a coward on making the hard decisions, because the second you go into austerity, you're not going to get paid because you're not going to be there next election, which there should be term limits on Congress anyways, but a video for another day. So the only way really out of that position is strategic defaults and austerity combined with printing to solve the government pension problem. And if you haven't watched the government pension problem video that I was explaining, go watch that video. The austerity, if you try and modify programs to basically wait out austerity, it doesn't really work. So you're gonna have to do a short-term, very hard austerity measure, because a long-term austerity measure doesn't really work. Like, there are people that advocate for increasing the age of Social Security, which is already bankrupt if you watch that video. But the age that they would increase the age of retirement to in Social Security is almost the life expectancy age. You're basically not providing a pension at all anymore. because you're going to die before you meaningfully draw down the pension that you've committed to forcefully by government mandate the entirety of your life or working life. And it's just nonsense. And there's no good long solution to this. You can't just step out retirement. It's if you try and step out retirement, you'll basically disincentivize work, because it won't be a 7% tax to pension. It'll be a 7% theft, because you'll never receive the benefit for the pension that you were promised. And if everyday citizens realize that, we're going to have a lot bigger problem than the pension funds needing to be bailed out. And it won't be a dollar problem. It'll be a blood problem. So the austerity you really would have to commit to is you'd have to shut off Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Let me just pause and say, all of this stuff has to be done together. Otherwise, it's just all useless. Because you need to eliminate negative cash flows out of the government at the same time as you resolve debt burdens to the government as well. You'll understand why I chose the word resolve here in a second. You'll basically just have to shut down Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and you'll have to allow working adults whose parents are above the age of 62 to enroll them as dependents on their insurance plans. And you'll depress prices of houses because people will be distressed sellers without pension funds. But the 60-year-olds working in grocery stores aren't there because they're having fun. They're there because they have no other options. They're already distressed. They're just getting by. So you might as well just take the hard medicine and do it well. The next couple are going to certainly ruffle some feathers in some of the military guys. You have to reduce the number of people inside the United States Army. And you have to do it by divisions, not by brigades. Because you need to end negative drawdowns everywhere you can, or cost centers. But at the same time, if we're going to do all of this, you have to maximize your defensive position. And we do that by basically inter-service transfers of the U.S. Army to the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines. Calm down, Marines. You can take your pick of the litter of all of the infantry we have. God knows you love your pride and standards. The rest will either have to be inter-service transferred to the Navy, because the Navy is arguably the most important defensive position the United States has, minus some other bases like El Paso. You'd have to man your Marines and Navy to that extent, because you'd have to take up the position strategically of defending the U.S. mainland while we transition through this operation. And the only way to do that is to make pretty much the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean impassable to any adversaries that think that they could cross it to demand things. And you don't want to do that, because the second biggest air force in the world after the United States Air Force is the United States Navy. If you get through the onslaught of the U.S. Navy Air Force, when you arrive, you're still going to have the entire U.S. Air Force. And they will love the chance to paint them decals on their aircraft. The pension printing to save pretty much individual state pensions and Social Security was mentioned in another video. I'll go look at that. The other aspect of this is basically strategic defaults on adversaries and people who really don't matter. We're going to really step on some toes on this one with this, we'll say, thought exercise. So it's important to note before I get to these is the Bank of International Settlements doesn't have a standing army, and they can kick rocks. So the same spirit that made America still is pretty much in America. And if we have to take what we need to be successful, in case you haven't opened a history book, in the last 200 years, America will take what it wants. Ask Mexico on which river was in a treaty, because the lines are pretty well drawn in maps from that day on. All right, strategic default one is China. This is an economic adversary, tariff wars, etc., etc. They do a little bit of currency manipulation, we'll say. And they likely acquired the Singapore banks to basically launder their money from mainland China into Singapore, and then use that as a vector to get their money out. into the economic world. And that's also like a show of force. But they're having to like launder their money because their debt burden is extreme, and they're basically building all these colonies that their military can't access or support, and so they're relying on all of this Belt and Road Initiative people to basically not choose to shoot them because the Chinese Navy can't get out of the South China Sea, with the exception of like Djibouti. But yeah, China's not crossing the Pacific. Refer to the Battle of Midway. You don't want to do that. The other debt burden that they have is the real estate, like the Evergrande situation, and not allowing people to withdraw from their bank accounts in China. You got private, public, pent up debt with the intent of basically turning their country from what it was into a developed nation, which it's a developed nation. It's not a developing nation. It's just useful to label themselves as developing because then they have to abide by less rules. Voluntarily voiding and defaulting on the debt payment to China would create such a problem that they would be worried about getting out of their own situation, not crossing the ocean and traversing the ocean to deal with the threat of someone stealing a lot of your money would just incur more cost of what you're going to lose when you try and take it back. Because again, they'll go to the Bank of International Settlements and we'll say, "Show me your army." Japan has no ability to defend itself or project power. They've been like perpetually in a demographic decline, which the age of their population is extremely high. They have no young people to man their armies or boats. More importantly, I guess for Japan, and they're since the Battle of Midway, they've been perpetually in decline. They had a blip of like economic prosperity from an economic model that works really well and like an industrial engineering economic model. But if you don't have people, it really doesn't matter how good your system is because you're not willing to fight for it. You could take Japan's money too in the default because, again, they're not going to cross the ocean. Number 3 is Italy. This gets a little bit more tricky because they have aged population that don't have the ability to project power and they don't have the ability to redeem. It gets a little tricky because we have 3 major bases in Italy, 2 naval stations and 1 base where the 173rd is. There are other ports and other nations with airfields for the 173rd, but protecting a nation that does not have men to fill its own armies in a meaningful way is useless to provide us a benefit for the risk. The final one is pretty much all private banks because you don't want to create a single standing bank when this is all done. Granted, you're going to knock on 3 of the highest debt burdens to the United States when you do this. But if you don't knock private banks, you won't move the needle far enough and it won't work. You got to create chaos in the system and just firmly say these are the new rules and we'll behave now. And you're going to break their projections and their models. And bankers may take the sidewalk from the roof of a very tall building, but 60% of Americans have like less than $400 in their account. You're not going to hear them cry over the rest of the world being made to feel their reality. Without all of these interventions pretty much happening together to pay down the debt of the U.S. government, you're not going to get out of the position. You could take, I don't even know what these numbers are. You can get $1 trillion, $2 trillion. Let's just look this up real quick. So China holds $784 billion. So if you just refuse to pay them back, you're gonna have a credit problem, but you're gonna have a nice down payment to the future of America. So let's say 780. And then Japan. Japan owns $1 trillion, so you're $1.7 trillion out of the gate. Italy. Doesn't really have that much. So it could give me a good number. Italy probably owns Germany. But still, Italy can't punch its way out of a paper bag because it has no fighters. And we'll do private banks for 24 trillion. So you tack all those up, and 26 is probably partitioned out well. Yeah, 24 trillion. So you're at 27 trillion. Strategic default. We're not gonna grow our way out of this debt. You're gonna have to pick the people that you let starve, and most Americans are already starving. So if you tell them you're going to starve, you might get an indifferent shrug because they already are. What difference does it make? You'll also pick up about $2 trillion in free cash flow per year when you shut down Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and pretty much eliminating most of the U.S. Army minus SOCOM. You have to leave SOCOM up 160th to 82nd, and obviously the Rangers. And then you're a tough nut to crack. So when the Bank of International Settlements comes knocking, you just say, well, what? You'd have to do all of this probably within the shortest amount of time possible. That way you could make the Atlantic and Pacific difficult to cross. You'd have to keep El Paso, U.S. military base, and Corpus Christi as well for the border. But beyond that, this is the I don't care about keeping friends anymore to save my own health. You could reprice the world because credit would be destroyed, because credit access would be basically destroyed because you wouldn't have fractional reserve banking would bust, which already is. They repealed that in COVID-19. So, yeah, maybe I'll make a video on the new rules of credit. Given I just made the pension video and now I'm making this one because the Federal Reserve is going to cut rates. And, yeah. See where we go from there. That will probably be the next video. Yeah. See you guys in that one.